I decided we're going to go straight to the Pischei Tshuva, but you need to have your Shulchan Aruch open also. Okay, so again, we need our Shulchan Aruch on Reish Lamed Zayin, just to remind ourselves all the things that the Shulchan Aruch wrote, and we're going to go right into the Pischei Tshuva. I think we saw enough in the Chatam Sofer. Just 1 second. Okay, all right. The issues we're going to be dealing with here are what are the consequences of being called a Rasha? Where does it come from that you can call the person a Rasha? And the other issue we're going to deal with is the reversibility of it, where we if you remember, we saw Rabbeinu Tam that said he's a Rasha, and you force him to give it back, and there was a big machlokas about that. So we're going to see all this halacha lamaisa again. We'll go back in the Shulchan Aruch and see in the Pischei Tshuva. Daniel, you had a question? No. Okay. All right. So let's just remind ourselves in Reish Lamed Zayin. What we're going to be focusing on the words Nikra Rasha. The Pischei Tshuva, if you have the daf, it's the beginning of the daf. If you're in the original Shulchan Aruch, it's Od Bet. It's right at the beginning of the Pischei Tshuva. All right, where again, let's just read again. Let's read the halachas so we will remind ourselves, and then we'll go jump right into the Pischei Tshuva. Hamachzir achar davar liknoso. I'm in the Shulchan Aruch right now. Hamachzir achar davar liknoso. O l'sachro ben karka ben metaltalin ubo acher v'kenao nikra rasha. V'hu adin l'rotze lahaskir atzmo etzel acher. You want to hire yourself out. V'yesh omrim sheim bo liskos behefker o mekabel matana me'acher ubo acher v'kidmo eno nikra rasha. So it's a machlokas whether we're only nikra rasha if it's a business deal like Rabbeinu Tam or even Rashi, then it's even a davar shel hefker. So let's see now the Pischei Tshuva, Od Bet. If you're in the Pischei Tshuva, it's Od Bet, and if you're in the paper, it's the first Pischei Tshuva. Nikra Rasha. Kosav b'sefer Arid de Rabbanan Od Taf Tzadik Tet Nistapaknu I have Dvar Torah O Midivrei Sofrim Nami Rasha Mikri. Is this a Torah? Is he a Doraisa called a Rasha, or only Divrei Sofrim? Umatzati lemoram choshen mishpat siman lamed dalid ki hamagbia yaro al chavero lahakoso. Right, your famous story with Moshe Rabbeinu, Rasha lama, right? You know, Rama la when they called Dasav Aviram, right? Lama makes chavero, you call him a Rasha. If a person is merim yaro lahakoso, so is he pasul le'edus or not? He's called a Rasha. Is he pasul le'edus? So he says, "Hamagbia al chaver lechakoso pasul le'edus midrabana." What do we imply from that? Mashma dispirale de medivrei sofrim nami Rasha mikre v'dok. Meaning you can be called a Rasha even for violating a derabanan. The default was that you can only be called a Rasha if you violated divrei Torah. So no, we see that you can be called a Rasha even for violating Divrei Sofrim, and it's pretty clear that Ani HaMehapech b'charara ubo acher v'natla nikra Rasha, that could only be the Rabbana. There's no D'oraisa violation there. Okay. The Eini Yodea, I'm continuing in the Pischei Tshuva. Eini Yodea lama lo zachar divrei hasmasham siv koten zayin shekosov. Here's a sma afal pishe isur deoraisa mikol makom me'achar she'ein bo malkos. Okay, right? That it's an isur deoraisa, but since there's no malkos, that's why we call him a Rasha. Meaning, if he would do an isur deoraisa with malkos, we'd give him malkos. You don't call him a Rasha, you give him malkos. But the sma is saying that it's possible for somebody to do an isur deoraisa. And in order to be called a Rasha, you have to do an Isur D'oraisa. And therefore, one of the issues here is going to be, where did this come from that you can call him a Rasha? All right, and that's what's going to be in the next Pischei Tshuva. What's the source that you can call that he's a Rasha? Where did that come from? He's not a nice guy. He's certainly not doing Vasisa Yasher V'Hatov, but calling him a Rasha is much more severe, much more serious. Where it says in the Sma, if you remember the very first Sma, where it says Nikra Rasha, Umachrizan Allah B'Beit HaKnesset Sha'asa Maaseh Rasha Kazeh. We announce it in Shul. We announce in Shul. You should know. Everybody should know. In other words, really, what it is, it's an embarrassment. There's no restrictions on him. He's not Pasal Le'edus. and it could even be we'll give him an aliyah, but we want to embarrass him. That seems to be how the Sma understands the consequences of Russia. Okay, so now we want to go to, okay, now this is the continuation in the Piskei Tshuva. I have a pasuk there. I quoted the Gemara in Sanhedrin. You'll see why we need it in a minute. We'll actually go back to it in a minute. So continues the Piskei Tshuva. Va'ayin b'tshuvas maharit al harif the kedushin mevur denikra rasha midivrei kabbalah shekosav sham v'zel l'shona. What's the source? Ha de amrinan ani HaMehapech b'charara uba'achar v'notla denikra rasha lo it parish heichash kachan denikra rasha. Where do we get this from? Nehida avaryana mikri. He's certainly over, and we can say you're an avaryan. All right, an avaryan is like, again, apparently an avaryan, even though in modern Hebrew you would say an avaryan is a criminal, an avaryan seems to be a lower level than a rasha. You're an avaryan, you're not behaving properly, but we don't call you a rasha. A person who violates a din derabanan, you can call him an avaryan. But where do you get aval rasha? There's a misprint here. Aval rasha minole. There should be a mem there instead of a daled. Aval rasha minole. What's your source that he's called a rasha? Rasha is much worse than an avaryan. I need a source. By the way, you just see here, we can't make up our own laws and decide we're going to go start throwing around things. The guy did this, the guy did that. He's a rasha, he's an avaryan. No, there are well-defined categories here of what you need to violate in order to deserve a certain title or a certain status. Okay, so it's not clear where this Ani HaMehapech b'charara din came from. V'nira mishu, that he's going to quote a Gemara in Sanhedrin, which quotes a pasuk in Yechezkel. Hadi amrin himself perak hadisrofim. Ves eishes re'ehu lo timei. Go back for a minute. Take a look right above that in the again. You don't have it in your regular Piskei Tshuva, but on the daf I gave it to you. Darash Rav Acha B'Rebbi Chanina Ma'idechsiv El Haharim Lo Ochal Ve'enav Lo Nosa El Gelule Beis Yisrael Vel Eish Yisrael Lo Timei. It's Yechezkel, talking about all the terrible things the Jewish people did, and if you do this, you're called a rasha. And then afterwards it says if you don't do it, you're called a tzaddik. And what is the drasha on es eishes re'ehu lo timei? It doesn't mean that you committed adultery. That's not what we're talking about. That's not a question of a rasha and a tzaddik. Oh, a guy who didn't have adultery with his friend's wife is called a tzaddik? No. Shelo yorad le'imnus chavero. What does it mean, eishes chavero lo timei? He didn't mix in to his friend's business. He didn't yored le'umnuso shel chavero. That's the drasha in the Gemara. So now go back onto the Piskei Tshuva. Shelo yarad lenus chavero uksiv basrei. All right, a number of psukim later, about 15 psukim later, it says about the people who didn't do this, that tzidkas hatzadik olav tiyeh, verishas harasha olav tiyeh. The person who did this, that violated, is a rasha, and the person who didn't violate it is a tzaddik. Alma. So now, if you made a drasha on yored leumnuso shel chavero, that he's called a rasha, that's the Gemara's drasha. Alma rasha mikre b'chada mehanach. Any one of these things gives you the title of a rasha, and one of them is yored leumnuso shel chavero. So we haven't gotten there yet, because yored leumnuso shel chavero sounds a lot worse than Ani HaMehapech b'charara uboachar v'notla. Everybody realizes. I hope everybody realizes that we're talking about yored leumnus chavero, right? You muscled in on your friend's business. Okay, so he says like this: V'aval gav the yored leumnus chavero chamir tvei. Mishum de pasuk l'chiyuseh. If you're yored l'omnus chavero, you're depriving him of his livelihood. That's not the same thing as ani HaMehapech b'charara uboachar v'notla. That's not taking him away his parnasa, because he hasn't even gotten there yet. Yored l'omnus chavero means Reuven has a craft and he has a parnasa, and somebody muscles in, so he is depriving Reuven of parnasa. That's a rasha. So what does this have to do with Ani HaMehapech b'charara? Mikol makom hasam b'shel hefker mayri u'mehapech b'charara shel schirus shavahu lenichlas le'umnus shel hefker. What does it mean? So we have to remember, we talked about this in the Chatam Sofer. So what does it mean, an umnus shel hefker? An umnus shel hefker means that I am I have a profession and I'm trying to get customers. So those customers are really still they're out there, they're still hefker because I don't own them, as opposed to pilching a customer. In other words, you're an insurance agent and you have a client. Okay, you're a banker and you have a client, and somebody comes and seduces away the client from you. That's clearly Yoreh Lu'nusa Shel Chaver. That's much worse. That's Mamish Pasak L'Chiyusi. But Yoreh Lu'nusa Shel Chaver means that I have a profession, and I have a store that gets customers, and you muscle in to take away the customers before I get there. So that's called Umnus Shel Hefker. Meaning there's a comparison between Yored Leumnuso Shel Chavero of Hefker and an Ani HaMehapech B'Charora, where the guy in Tosas's world, where we don't talk about Ani HaMehapech B'Charora being Charora Hefker, we talk about Reuven's trying to get a job. Tosas understood the Mahapech B'Charora as a guy's trying to get a job in the bakery. He wants to get a job in the bakery, and you come in and you get the job before him while he's trying to get the job. That's an Ani HaMehapech B'Charora. Okay, so that's like somebody who pulls away customers before the Baal Umnus has the customers, and therefore he wants to say that's the source for making a Rasha. Certainly, according to Shitas Tosfos, that's why we make the guy. That's why we can call the guy a Rasha. Is that clear till here? Okay, the ayin b'tshuvas chatam sofer, which we saw. Okay, sheheviu because of alav. I have to look up that abbreviation. It comes from a pasuk in Koheles. The abbreviation means divrei pi chacham chen. Divrei pi chacham chen. It's a praiseworthy thing. The guy said good. In Yiddish we would say good gesagt. All right, he agrees with it. He agrees with it. Okay, the herach sham bevir dvarav. Again, so now he's accessing the Tosfos, where he makes a difference between Hefker and not Hefker. The ayin ber heitev, the haritva hevi b'shem Rabbeinu Tam, v'chol makom shomer chachamim nikra rasha. Okay, I'm sorry. So we're about to shift gears. Okay, so the source seems to be from that Gemara, is that a person who is not Yored L'Nuso Shel Chavero is called a rasha, and we're making a comparison, certainly according to Tosfos, that a guy who takes away the deal, if a guy takes away the deal before you got there, not because it's hefker, but because it's a business deal, you're called a rasha because we say you could go find a different business deal. Just like we tell the guy who's taking away the customers, go find other customers. Don't muscle in to the street where this guy has his business. Now, okay, so that's basically the source for how we get to the idea of Rasha. You realize it's a little bit not simple. Why is he called a Rasha? It's a gray area. Where did that come from? All right, except for the only place it is the Gemara in Kedushin, where it says that that's the only place we find such a thing. And therefore, since it's paskin lahalacha, we want to know what the source is, and they're using the source of the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Okay, now we have a question about reversibility. Ein be'er teitev simin kavav mashakasu v'aritva hevi b'shem Rabbeinu Tam kol makom sha'amru chachamim nikra rasha mechayvin oso lahachzir hamekach. So this has a lot of ramifications. Okay, it goes. I mean, we go back to the Gemara in Bava Basra where the guy gave the money, and then Reuben gave the money to the goy, and then Shimon swept in and took the property, and it says nikra rasha. All right, so the Rashbam says he's a rasha. Tosa says he's not a rasha. It's hefker. Hefker is not a rasha, and therefore it's okay. Okay, but there are other places where we say nikra rasha. All right, and that it's reversible. This is going to be a big machlokas whether when you do the Mahapech B'Charara U'Ba'achar Benato, the second guy who took it away from the ani, does he have to give it back to avoid being called a rasha, or he doesn't have to? Again, if he gives it back, of course he stops being a rasha. The question is, can the Beis Din force him? Is it judiciable to force him? And Rabbeinu Tam said yes. That was the Rabbeinu Tam. Kol makom she'amru chachamim nikra rasha mechayvin oso lachzor hamekach. That was the Rabbeinu Tam in a couple of places. Okay, v'hu zal cholek alav. The Ritva argues. Okay, that he says no. Ma pitom. That's the case of the goy who got the money and lost it, and it became hefker. and Shimon came in and took it. Here's where we get into it. Helu ha'achronim, the makom shenikra Rasha mikol makom ein mechayven also based in lahachzer. Where do you see that we're not mechayev? Now we're going to go back to our Gemara in Kedushin. Midyamrina beperka omer bekedushin, right? Zvune, I'm sorry, not there. It's a different Gemara. Zvune lo mezavnina. There's a question when somebody does something in a business deal that the rabbis say not to do. Do the rabbis invalidate the sale and say zvina lo zvini? It's not a deal. You did a deal illegally. Again, I suspect that this is also in secular law. Sometimes you could make a deal that's illegal, and so therefore the deal is not valid. Or you could make a deal that you're not supposed to do, but at the end of the day, the deal is valid. So zvini lo zvini. So if you understand that when you do something you're not allowed to do, zvini lo zvini. So we could say then that the HaMehapech, that the bo'achar v'notlo who did something illegal, we're going to say we're not allowing you to keep it. Your kinyan is an invalid kinyan, and that's why we would reverse it. Okay, kedivei rach shapir shemachayvin. Ad kan l'shona gam tshuvas marik sof shoresh because of kebeb pshitus. V'chein posak b'tshuvas marshal. Right, because of Sham Bezel Loshan. In other words, they are arguing on Rabbeinu Tam. They're about to argue on Rabbeinu Tam to say, Ma Pitom, he's a Rasha, but where do you force him to give it back? He's a Rasha. He didn't do. It doesn't say Zvina lo Zvina. It doesn't say it doesn't have effect. It has effect, and he's a Rasha. So you can't force a guy to give it back if it has effect. The Tamani, here's the sharp argument on Rabbeinu Tam. Remember, it's Rabbeinu Tam who says that we force the Rasha to give it back, to undo as being a Rasha. Toma anim yotza divrei zemi pi Rabbeinu Tam. Shil malei nishtach Torah mi Yisrael hichzira bepilpulo v'yishge bezeh. It's a mistake. It's got to be a mistake. The gamzani lo matzati remez b'chol haposkim shum tzad hava amina lachzor hamekach ela likroso Rasha. We never found any indication that we make the bo'achar v'notla give it back. We only found that he's called a Rasha. The herich bezeh, right? The hiskim b'shuvas masas binyamin. Okay. V'ayin b'shuvas chemda shlomo. Right? Shehizkir divrei maharshal. The hiskim imoim de'ein bo din chazora klal. Right? Again, there's a big lineup here of against Rabbeinu Tam that you call him a Rasha, but you can't force him to undo it. If he wants to not be a Rasha, he undoes it, but you can't force him. Raksha machrizin sha'asa ma'aser resha kidei lach limo shelo yaseh kazod. It makes it sound like it's prophylactic for the future. We don't want a guy to do this anymore. You guys should know this is not an appropriate way to behave, and our goal is to stop people from doing it. The efsher yesh biyad bezdin, efsher yesh biyad bezdin laonsho avono acher derek knas kidei shelo yaseh kazod. Certainly, Bezdin has the power to give the guy sanctions, all kinds of punishments, but they can't reverse the deal. The deal is done. The kinyan was made. And even though they want to call him a Rasha, and they may want to say you can't get an aliyah, or nobody should do business with you for a week, all of that is a legitimate thing for a Rasha. But where do you get the right to reverse a kinyan that works? Again, it was ani HaMehapech b'charara, and before the deal was closed, I came and I took the job. Reuven's trying to get a job, okay? And before the deal was closed, I came in and I got the job. So you can't tell me I got to resign and give him back the job. You can make all kinds of sanctions against me, okay? But where do we get this idea, say all these achronim, or even rishonim, that we reverse and force the bo'ach v'notcha to give it back? And now we're going to get to our Gemara in Kedushin in a minute. Aval hamekach kana legamrei. Because of Od, now we get into the issue of Shogeg. So the first thing is you can't force him to give it back. And B'Shogeg de lo yada, Pashat de'en alav shum din klal. I remember we also got into this, and we're going to see more. When the guy did it by accident, he didn't know that there was a Mahapech. Is he called a Rasha or not? Well, he's saying no. If he did it by accident, you can't call him a Rasha. You have a very simple kasha from our Gemara in Kedushin, because the Gemara in Kedushin clearly, Rabbi Abba did not know, right, that Rav Gidel was trying to get the property. Umash Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Abba Hashta Nami Nesve Nehale Mar. So wait a minute. Now we have two problems. All right. First of all, Rabbi Abba did it by accident, so he didn't know. Okay. So A, we're calling him a Rasha, and B, Rav Yitzchak Nafcha said, okay, now that you found out about it, give it back. So that sounds like two problems. A, it looks like you're a Rasha even if you did it by accident. And B, once you're called a Rasha, you got to give it back. Everybody see the two things that come out of that Gemara, which both of them, these Rishonim disagree with. How are they going to answer it? Very simple. Very simple answer. And this is going to come up in other opinions. Okay? Umash Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Abba Hashtanami Nesve Nehale Mar Hu Rak Lemidas Chasidus. He wasn't telling him that you're mechuyev to give it back, but it's a good thing to give it back. Midas Chasidus. Ayin Shamot Shekasa V'Zel Shono Ulanius Daiti Yesh Mokam Sofek Hecha Dahaya Mezid Afim Machzir HaMekach Im Metukan B'Zeh HaMaisa Rosh Hasha'asa. Now he's going to another extreme. It's very possible that even when you give it back, you're still a Rasha. The fact that you did it, you might be chayv to give it back, but you're still called a Rasha. Kedisa b'bava mitzia daf chavav not lo lifnei yush almanat legozla. This is we once talked about this. All right, you're walking down the street and you see a mitzia, so you're mechuyev to pick it up and give it back. Okay, what happens if you picked it up before yush, and therefore you're chayv to give it back, but when you picked it up, you intended to keep it? So if you remember, we talked about this in the Sugyas of Hashavas Aveda. So not la lifnei yush, al manat legozlo, over bekulan. What does over bekulan mean? Hashef teshivim. You were mevatel the essay hashef teshivim. You were mevatel you violated the lavlo tu chalis alem, and you certainly were mevatel hashef teshivim. Okay, and then af al gav the hichzira laachar yush. Matana ba'alma hudiyoiv. And the Gemara says, okay, so I picked it up legozla. So I violated lo tuchal lisalem. I violated hashet teshive. Okay? Okay, you know what? I did tshuva. I picked it up to steal it. So it's mine. But I want to undo what I did. So I give it back to the owner. What does it say? Didn't undo anything. You're a gazlan, and you violated, and the giving is a matana. All right? Matana be'alma hudiyoivle. Okay? So you see that it's not, you can't reverse it. It's not reversible. So once you're called a Rasha, he wants to make a comparison. Once you're called a Rasha, just like if you're called a Gazlan in the Mitzia, you can't undo it. You violated everything. And all you did is you gave it a matana because it was a lost object. Okay, but so he wants to say I'm a Rasha and I can't undo it. The fact I give it back doesn't undo it. He says Ein Choshen Mishpat Reish Nun Tet the Chol Hecha the Ein Bo Chazara Ein HaIsra Metukan BaHaChazara Im Lo Sha'asa Kein Derech Tshuva VeCharota. It's a little bit tricky here. If there's a chiyuv, when is there a chiyuv of Chazara? B'Heshiv Esagzela. When I steal something, I'm a gazlon. So then there's a Torah law. Heshiv Esagzela. So if I do a Heshiv Esagzela when I had to do it, then I undid my Gzela. But if it isn't legislated that I have to do it, so he's saying like this, that if I'm a Nikra Rasha and I'm not mechuyev to give it back, then even if I give it back, I'm still a Rasha. I haven't undone it. That's a big chiddush. But that's what he wants to say. In other words, you did something wrong, you are a Rasha. And you're not mechuyev to give it back. And because you're not mechuyev to give it back, there's no way to undo it unless, he alludes, I'm doing it back in the context of tshuva. I think the David Lerner alluded to this way back. That if what I'm doing is in order to do tshuva, then I can undo it and get rid and stop being called a Rasha. אבל אם אינו עושה כן רק להינצל מן ההחלמה שיכריז עליו ברבים, he's only giving it back because I want you guys to stop embarrassing me. I'm not really doing tshuva, but I see you guys are embarrassing me, so I want you guys to stop embarrassing me. Ein bezed dai hashev kiven shelo nitan lahashava umishna ba'al mahudi. It should be matana ba'al mahudiyov. Should be matana hudi al mahudiyov. So we've got here a very big, again, a big machlokas here, whether you're mechuyev to give it back or not. And ironically, if you're not mechuyev to give it back, then giving it back doesn't undo it unless you did it b'derech tshuva. But if you see that they're walking around calling you a Russia, and you can't stand the embarrassment, your wife says, I can't show my face in shul anymore. You got to get them to stop calling you a Russia. And so, okay, I'll give it back to him. But you're not doing it mitzad tshuva, then they can keep calling you a Russia.
But doesn't that go against Menashe, who was going to be cooked alive, and he did tshuva under duress?
That's not. Leave that. Leave those things. Okay. Right now we're talking about dinei mominus. We're talking about a dinei mominus. That's all we're going to talk about. Okay. So now let's go on go back into the Shulchan Aruch, because there's another issue here. Where is it here? Okay. So let's go back into the Shulchan Aruch. Go to the Ramah. All right. We want to the Ramah. Right. Where am I looking for? No. Okay, let's pick it up where we left off. Okay, all right, so the Yesh Omrim, let's pick it up with the Yesh Omrim. Let's go back into the Shulchan Aruch. The Yesh Omrim, she'im ba'al liskos behefker, o mekabel matana me'acher, u'ba acher v'kidmo, eno nikra Rasha. That's right in time. Kivin she'eno davar hamotzei lo b'makom acher. Okay, v'akona karka al neitzer chavero, afal pi she'ein ba mishum dina de bar metzra, yochol ba'al meitzar liknosa v'lo mikri Rasha. Okay. V'chein in kone dover echad uba chavero v'yuchal liknosa bizol. That's also a question whether a cheap price is that like a metzia or not. Eino motzu liknoso kach b'mokam acher. Have kamo metzia v'yuchal liknoso kol zman shelo zocha bo hakod. Okay. V'yesh omrim delo shna, that both hefkat's Rashi, both hefker and mecher is all the same. Okay. V'svar rishona ikar. Again, we paskin like Rabbeinu Tam. Okay. Right. Okay. Then he goes into the Ani Usher, which we're not going to talk about now. We need to go down to Od Gimel. Okay. Continue in the Ramah. Dafka ba'ani abba ba'asher lo. Okay. Im lo she'eno motzui da'az afilu ba'asher. Remember we talked about that. Okay. And now we go down. Here's the important thing. This comes from the Mordechai. I'm in the Ramah, just where he's going to quote the Mordechai lahalacha. V'kol ze lo mayri ela kishekvar posku hadamim shebeinehen ve'ein mechusarim ela hakinya aval im mechusarim adayin hapsika shehamocher rotze bekach ve'hakona rotze yoser. In other words, they're still arguing about price. So then, right, muter la'acher liknoso Beinim Amocher Akum or Yisrael, meaning even a goy's, we're even going to protect the goy's rights to get a fair price. Okay? Yeah, okay. So now let's see what the Pischei Tshuva has to say about this. Okay, so this is basically the Mordechai. So the Pischei Tshuva is Od Gimel. Avalim Mechusarin, what was the Lashon again? Avalim Mechusarin Adayin Hapsika there's no HaMehapech v'charor, says the Pischei Tshuva. Ayin beprisha, we did see this prisha. Shekosav v'ata noagim lifsok al kiyotzi bezeh shehu hasogas gvul. Okay, it's not HaMehapech v'charor nikra Rasha, but if I'm negotiating to buy something and you step in, it's called hasogas gvul. In other words, you're encroaching on my territory. So of course you got to understand that can't be stopped every time somebody starts a negotiation and somebody else steps in. It's not automatically hasagas gvul. So Reuben is coming to buy something from Shimon. They're arguing. Dalid, Tnehu the Be'arba. The buyer says I want 6. The seller says I want 6, and the buyer says I'm going to give you 4. At that point, umit asking bepisuko zelahosif zeligroa, and they're arguing. They're in the middle of an argument. The buyer is trying to get it up, down, and the seller's trying to get it up, and they're in the middle of the argument. The lulei shaba shlishi, and if Levi wouldn't have come in, Reuben and Shimon at the end, they would have. I think somebody mentioned this earlier also. Right? Reuben and Shimon, eventually they're going to get to a compromise. Hayu mashlim nafsham. Zem mikri gam kein hasagas gvul. That's what we mean by hasagas gvul. That means you're again, hasagas gvul literally is moving the boundary and taking property from somebody else. But it comes into the halachas when we talk about unfair competition. We did this when we did the sugis of unfair competition. Hasagas gvul. So if Reuben and Shimon are in the middle of arguing and negotiating, and Reuven, the buyer, is trying to get it down, and Shimon, the seller, is trying to get it up, and they're in the middle of the negotiations, and somebody comes in and buys it at the price that the seller wanted, he didn't do any, he's not a rasha, but it's a sagas gvul, and therefore it's inappropriate. The hada amru she'enu nikra sagas gvul. When do we say it's not even a sagas gvul achu mashvim bepisuko? So when do we say it's not? When do I avoid the accusation of a sagas gvul? Says the Piskei Tshuva. All right, hainu kishahalokeach halach mehamocher the Amar lo eten leoter. He said the buyer walks away and says, "I'm very sorry. This is my final offer," and the seller says, "I'm very sorry. I'm not selling it for 4," and the buyer walks away. The minute the buyer walks away, that's then Levi can come in. He's certainly not a ba'acher v'notla. He's not even hasagas gvul. In other words, since the Sma talked only about pisuk damim, we need to know exactly what does it mean pisuk damim? What's the definition? And again, so the Piskei Tshuva is saying that there are 3 levels. They're in the middle of negotiations. Okay, I'm sorry. Now let's start with the worst. They agreed on a price, but they didn't make a kinyan. And then, right, they agreed on a price. They agreed on 6, and they didn't make a kinyan. And Levi comes in before they made a kinyan, and he offers 6 or 7. And the seller sells it to him. That's ani HaMehapech b'charara and nikra rasha, and Levi's a rasha. But we haven't dealt with the seller yet. And we may get to that later. Did the seller do anything wrong? Remember, the seller agreed to sell it for 6 to the buyer. And then somebody else came in and offered him either the same or more, and he sold it to him. So the second guy is for sure a rasha. What about the seller? Did the seller do anything inappropriate? Or is the seller allowed to say, listen, Chazal always protect the seller. And who knows, he agreed on the money. We're going to have this in a Shayla Lamaisa later. I'm the seller. I'm allowed to say, we agreed on a price. We agreed on 6. And he said, okay, I'm coming back tomorrow to pay you. And somebody walks in with cash and says, here's 6, or certainly if here's 7. Since there was no kinyan, why is the seller limited? Okay, and therefore that's the question: whether the second guy certainly did something wrong. Levi certainly did something wrong because Reuven had already agreed to pay the seller's price, and they had pisuk damim, and they're just missing a kinyan. That's the classic case of ba'acher v'notla nikra rasha. Okay, and therefore that's the ultimate. The next level down is that they don't have pisuk damim, but they're still negotiating. So then we're saying that if Levi comes in to offer what the seller wants, he's certainly not called a rasha, but he's called hasagas gvul, because the assumption is that the buyer and the seller would have agreed, would have met somewhere in the middle, and therefore Levi is legitimate in that sense, but he violates hasagas gvul. And the third case is where the buyer walks away or the seller walks away and says, "I'm very sorry. If you don't meet my price, I have nothing to say to you." At that point, there's not even a sagas gvul. Okay, those are the 3 levels that the Piskei Tshuva wants to point out.
And so, is the third party called a rasha in the first case?
Yes, if there was an agreement on price, and the only thing missing is a kinyan, and then Levi comes in and offers either the same or more, he's a Russia.
Then what about the second case?
That's the classic case of HaMehapech b'charora u'boachar v'natla. That was the Mordechai. It's built on the Mordechai. That you can't activate that unless there was pisuk damim. The middle case, while they're negotiating, so you can't call him a Russia because they're still negotiating, all right? But it's certainly inappropriate. That's called a sagas bull.
But he's not a Russia.
No, definitely not.
But
Why do you go?
from the seller, though, even in the first case, is allowed to do it.
The seller, again, if they agree, that's I say that's the question: is whether the seller was also lo beseder when there was pisuk damim. That's not so clear.
Right.
Why did you give a sort of easy example for the seller of Reuven and Shimon already agreed on a price, and then Levi says, I'll bring you cash right. I have cash in my pocket right now. Why didn't you give the same example? He says, I'll give you 7. You guys agreed on 6, but I also have to go home. Right?
Well, no, so nothing happened yet. But okay, here let's play out Dan's scenario. Okay, so you got Reuven and Shimon negotiating. They come to a price 6. Okay, and Reuven says, "Okay, I'm going home to get the money. I'll be back in 2 hours." And Levi comes. So right now there's the potential for bo'achar v'natla, but he's only a Russia if he actually makes a kinyan on it. But if Levi goes home, Levi says, "I'll give you 7." And the seller says, "Wow, 7? Okay, I agreed on 6, but we didn't make a kinyan. Good, give me 7." And Levi said, "Oh no, I don't have the money. I also have to go home and get it. Freeze frame. So now nobody's nothing. You can't become a Russia until you actually make a kinyan in it. Levi is.
But why isn't this just exactly the same as what we've been saying? That the I forget her names. Let's say Reuven, who said, "I'm going to go home and get the 6." So he's exactly the ani.
Okay. The only okay. Let me pinpoint the issue that you're missing. Levi can never be called a Russia until he's natla. Natla means he made the kinyan in it.
Right.
You described a situation where everything is in flux.
Got it. I understand.
Okay. So of course, Reuven and Shimon agreed on 6, but until there's a kinyan, Levi can come in and buy it, but he's a Russia. But you can't call him a Russia until he actually buys it. In other words, if he says, "I'll give you 7, but I got to go home," and while he's going home, Reuven comes in with 6. Okay, freeze frame. So now if Shimon sells it to Reuven for 6, everything's fine. If Shimon sends Reuven packing because he says, "I'm very sorry, while you were getting the money, Levi came in and offered me 7, and I'm going to sell to Levi," freeze frame. So Reuven is allowed to scream. If Levi does that, he's a Russia. Okay, and it could be, I'm not sure what the status of the seller is, we'll have to deal with that. But Levi then, if he came in and gave the 7 and made a kinyan, then he's a Russia. But he can't be called a Russia until he owns it.
Right.
Okay? All right, so everything's clear here? Okay. Now one last thing, and that has to do with the Melamed. And that's where Moshe Feinstein's tshuva is actually going to deal with the Melamed. I'm not sure if you guys even peeked at Rav Moshe's tshuva, but first let's go to Siyuf Beis. Go back into the Shulchan Aruch and Siyuf Beis. Okay? So we're in Siyuf Beis in the Mechaber. Osur leMelamed. Lahaskir atzmo lebala bayit sheyesh lo melamed acher bebeso. Okay? So Reuven has... let's go. Reuven's a Melamed, and he's working for Shimon as a Melamed in Shimon's house. And Levi comes, and he wants the job. That's the case. Also, Melamed, in our case, that's going to be Levi. Lahaskir atzmo lebal habayit, that's Shimon. Sheyesh lo Melamed acher bebe, so that's Reuven. Im lo shiomer abal habayit, ein rosoni la'akev ha'melamed sheli. Of course, unless Shimon says, I'm not so happy with Reuven, so then of course Levi can come and take the job. Okay, so Levi's not allowed to take the job away from Shimon, who has the job, from Reuven, who has the job. Reuven's the Melamed in Shimon's house. Levi can't take the job away from Reuven. Okay, but the reverse. Avalim sochar balabayit milamed ach echad. But if the balabayit Shimon hired Ruvain as a malamed, then Yochel balabayit acher Levi, as another balabayit can come and hire Ruvain away from Shimon. Liskor oto malamed atzmo. So again, that's the difference. The guy who is looking for the job, he's not allowed to take the job away from somebody who has it. That's HaMehapech b'charara, the guy who has the job. You're taking away the job from him. Okay, and again, that would certainly be even according to Tosfos. But if a balabayit wants to hire away the existing malamed, so then that's going to be a machlokas Rashi Tosfos, because according to Tosfos it's okay because it's hefker. Hefker means it's not available anywhere else. Why is it not available anywhere else? Because the balabayit, the second balabayit is going to say this quality malamed, he's not available anywhere else, and therefore it's considered like hefker, and there's no anei HaMehapech b'charora. Whereas according to Rashi, it might be. But the reason the Mechaber paskins that it's okay, as does because it came from Tosfos, and Tosfos' shita is that there's no anei HaMehapech b'charora in hefker. And that's the difference between hiring away a malamed that's working for somebody else versus taking away the job from somebody who has the job. Okay, everybody remembers all of this. Now let's see, there's a two-line piskei tshuva, very important. Yochel balabayit acher, ein be'er teite v'havile kedavar she'eno motzui. He says it's like hefker. Yochel balabayit acher means that Levi, the second balabayit, is allowed to hire away Ruvain the Malamed from Shimon, because Ruvain the Malamed is like, quote, don't misunderstand the words, it's like Hefker because it's not available anywhere else. The point of Hefker is it's not available anywhere else. Well, Levi can say, this Malamed Ruvain, he's such a good Malamed, he's not available anywhere else. And therefore I can hire him away from Shimon. Okay? I.e. Rashi, that you're not allowed, even behefker, there's also anei HaMehapech b'charara. The oser afilu b'mitzia, gam b'zeh oser. Because it was only Rabbeinu Tam who said it's okay, because Rabbeinu Tam holds that there's no anei HaMehapech behefker. But according to Rashi, that even behefker there's an anei HaMehapech, because, hey, why are you mixing into my business? Go somewhere else, even though it's not available, it's your problem. It's another proof. All the Piskei Tshuva is saying, the Be'er Heitev is saying, it's a proof that the Mechaber through and through holds like Rabbeinu Tam, i.e., there is no restriction in a davar shel hefker. Okay. Anyway, and that's basically where we are. Okay. Any questions on that before we go to Moshe Feinstein? Everybody, okay? Everybody want? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Questions?
We're gonna have to deal, obviously, with the seller.
With the what?
The seller. The seller needs to be addressed to. I mean, they're like, it's definitely the fact that he basically was in agreement already, and it was just a matter. But without a Kenyan, it was just a matter. The money wasn't right there, and now another guy comes and offers more, or at a better term. It needs to be related to.
Okay, so let me throw it back at you guys. And what do you think about the seller? Why is it not so obvious that the seller is also in breach?
So
What would be the right? What is it a double standard to treat the second buyer, and call him a rasha, and no consequences to the seller?
I remember, Rabbi, when we learned about the bar mitzvah, the klal was that the seller doesn't have to lose.
Okay.
So maybe that is the guideline here too. So if all of a sudden something better comes,
Right.
he doesn't lose. Maybe, I don't know.
It's not his problem that the guy came in and offered him a better deal. From his perspective, he can take the better deal. It's the guy who stepped in as the Russia, but from the seller's perspective, he's just going to take whatever the best deal is at that time.
Yeah, but Ephraim Rachman is not going to like this, right?
Ephraim, what do you say?
Sorry.
We have a double standard here. We have a double standard. The double standard is whether the
Well,
whether we're going to are we treating the double standard is that the buyer who steps in when there was an agreement on price, we're certainly calling him a Russia. But what about the seller?
Yeah.
Why
So
if the seller sells to the second guy? Why is he off the hook, or is he also inappropriate?
well, the seller and the first buyer are the initial parties to this transaction. It's the second buyer, the third player in this game, who comes in and tears it apart. So I can see why he's called a Russia. But the seller, he's had the same position all along. He says, I'm going to sell to the highest bidder. To be called a Russia because
he agreed to. Here's Daniel's problem. But
he agreed. He agreed, but he didn't have a kinyan.
So Daniel, that's going to be the answer. Again, it is a machlokus. Okay, you will see. We'll get to it later down the road. But it is a machlokus whether the seller is also viewed as behaving inappropriately. He's certainly not a Russia, but he may have been behaving inappropriately. Or as Ephraim said, look, the seller's job, and you saw that from Bar Metzra, the seller's job is to maximize profit. On a certain level, we always say, so is Judaism capitalist or socialist? Okay, right? So we're a benign capitalism. Okay, at the end of the day, the profit motive is what keeps everything rolling. Okay, as long as it's not done inappropriately. So the simple understanding is that the seller, you didn't bring me the money. We didn't make a kinyan. We agreed. Okay, but at the end of the day, I'm allowed to look out for my interest. Again, I'm going to add another point. It's not mentioned explicitly, but I, as the seller, am allowed to say, you know why I took Levi's money? Because I didn't know whether Shimon was going to come back or not, whether Reuben's going to come back. I was worried maybe he won't come back. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Okay. The only thing is, I think that Dan mentioned, what happens if the seller, the Levi also says, I'll give you 7, but I got to come back tomorrow.
Right. But what happens? Is the seller supposed to pick up his phone and tell the first party, listen, I got a better offer. It's either now or not.
For sure, Asisa Yasher Vatov would demand that. Right. Okay, but as we're going to see, the idea of legislating Asisa Yasher Vatov is not so simple.
Right.
Okay.
We thought it also right. It was just like it's a good thing to do, good thing to hold back, right?
Okay. Ramosha Feinstein is going to talk about this. Okay, let's go into Ramosha, but we'll start with Ramosha Feinstein today, and Bezrat Hashem we'll finish it on. I always get for today's Sunday, right, guys?
Yeah.
Today's Sunday.
Yeah.
Finish it on Wednesday. Whenever I give Chabura, I never know whether it's Sunday or Wednesday. I apologize. It's so set in my mind. Chaburas are Sunday, Wednesday, and I just don't remember which one it is. Okay. So says Ramosha Feinstein, Inyan HaMehapech b'charara bilo yada. So Ramosha Feinstein is already throwing in the issue of what happens if the second guy didn't realize that there was a Mahapech b'charara. Okay? All right. So hine b'davar ma. Here's the scenario. Here's the story. We'll probably just get to the story today. Echad haya etzlecha b'davar liskor otcha lilmod eze sha'osim hatalmidim. So there's Reuven. And Reuven is being the principal of the school is negotiating with Reuven to hire him to teach a few hours a day to learn with students. Okay, so Reuven has been negotiating. Okay, bimei hakayitz, summer vacation. Ve'ata chashavta shehu tzarich litein lecha tshuva b'davar gemar haschirus, and you're waiting for the principal to come back and commit to the job. Because you thought that you told him, I want the job, and the only reason we didn't sign a contract is because I'm waiting, because maybe the principal didn't yet have approval, or the principal's considering whether he wants to hire me at what we agreed upon. But the principal thought, but the principal thought, I'm waiting for Reuven to give me the answer. So Reuven thought that he's waiting for the principal to give him an answer. And the principal thought he's waiting for Reuven to give him an answer. And meanwhile, since the principal was waiting for Reuven to give him an answer, and Reuven didn't yet tell him yes, so from the principal's perspective, they hadn't yet finalized any deal. So the principal went and he hired Shimon, Reuven's friend. okay, to be a rebbe, a summer school rebbe. Now Reuven comes to complain. Shimon was not allowed to take the job. Midin mahapech b'charara, because we had already agreed on all the terms. We agreed on the terms. He just hadn't committed to me, because I thought he hadn't committed to me. Okay, v'chavercha toein lo yada she'ata ratzita lihistaker. He didn't know that you agreed. Af sheyada b'davar shediber imcha. So Shimon knew that the principal was negotiating with Reuven, but he never thought that Reuven had agreed to the job. And therefore, if the principal came to offer me the job, it must have been that you said no. Otherwise, why is the principal offering me the job if you said yes? The principal never would have offered me the job if you said yes. So I was sure that you said no. Okay? So vada he shafta lo she'en charotze. So Reuven is saying, I wanted the job and I was waiting for the principal to commit to me. When the principal went to Shimon, Shimon took the job because he thought that Reuven had said no, and that's the only reason why the principal's coming to him. So therefore, Shnechem rotzim leida dati. Okay, so we've got to realize here that we just got into the question. There are two questions that are going to be dealt with here. One is that the Bo'achar v'Notla didn't know that there's a Mahapech, because as far as Shimon was concerned, he assumed that Reuven had said no, so Reuven's out of the picture, so that he thought that there's no Mahapech, which is exactly like our case in Kiddushin, right? That Rabbi Abba didn't know that Rav Gidel wants the land. Okay, here he assumed that Reuven had said no, and we're out. So the first thing is that Shimon didn't know that there's a Mahapech. And then the question becomes also going to be, as you'll see, that if we're going to say that even when you didn't know, it's still Mahapech, is it reversible? Because what does Reuven want? Reuven wants the deal between Shimon and the principal to be canceled so that Reuven can get the job. So that's reversing what Shimon did. Reuven wants to reverse what Shimon did. So both of those questions are coming to are hitting the road, are hitting the ground here. Okay, so we have just another couple minutes. Let's just get started. Hine, here's Rav Moshe Feinstein. B'shulchan Aruch Hoshen Mishpat Siman Reish Lamed lo huzkar chiluk ben yada hasheni sharishin hichzer achar hadavar liknoso o lahaskir atzmo o lo yada. First thing Rav Moshe Feinstein points out, nowhere in Siman Reish Lamed Zayin is there any indication that it matters whether the second guy knew or not. Doesn't say anything. So Rav Moshe Feinstein assumes that if there's a condition that's not mentioned, right? It doesn't mention in the Shulchan Aruch that the halacha depends on who won the World Series. So what do you draw from the fact that the halacha doesn't talk about who won the World Series? The halacha is not impacted by who won the World Series. Since it doesn't mention whether the second guy knew about the first guy or not, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, we're allowed to assume that it doesn't matter, because if it mattered, it should have been brought. Okay, that's the first step. And they're very common in halacha, is that whatever is not mentioned is assumed to be not relevant. The stoma nemar hadin. The din is always true. Mashma, sha'af below yada yesh alav chiyuv. Im eino rotze likari rasha, lahachzer u'lemocher larishon, v'limsor aschirus larishon. So he's saying very simple. He's making an assumption that knowledge is irrelevant. So now Shimon doesn't, you Shimon don't want to be called a Rasha, because says Rav Moshe, I'm going to consider you a Rasha, because at the end of the day you took Reuven's job that Reuven wanted, and you took it. So if you don't forego it and give it, quote, give it back to Reuven, i.e. Rabbeinu Tam, that you got to undo it by giving it back, we're going to call you a Rasha. Right? That's Rav Moshe Feinstein's psak. The Chen before B'Kedushin, and he brings a raya from the Gemara. Okay, not like the Pischei Tshuva brought. Okay, he's not calling it a midas chassidus at all. All right, Rabbi Abba lo haviyada de Rav Gidel HaMehapech be'ayara. So Rav Abba didn't know. That was the whole point. He didn't know. Umikol makom. Omar le Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka hashta nami neisva nehole mar. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka said, "Okay, you didn't know. Now you know. Now give it back." Alma afilu below yada. He's proving two things from the Gemara, taking everything literally. Rabbi Abba didn't know, and Rabbi Yitzchak saying you're a Rasha unless you give it back. All right, Alma afilu below yada im lo yoav al Rav Gidel nikra Rasha. Okay, so that's Rav Moshe's basic psak. Now he's going to go through all the challenges to that. That's the whole next page, page and a half of all the challenges. And that we will save Bezrat Hashem for Wednesday to see. Again, this is obviously, every one of these things is negotiable because we have Rishonim and Achronim saying every side, every possible side. We'll see how Rav Moshe Feinstein comes to his decision. Okay? All right. Good, Beseder? All right, Rabbi. I'll see everybody Bezrat Hashem on Wednesday.
Thank you. Shkach.
Thanks.